Okay, so I think that's all by way of notices, and now it's my great pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Boyle, who is certainly no stranger to this college. She's a member of the college here, she's Director of Studies, she's a Research Fellow, but as of this year she's also Mary Curie Fellow over in Cork University in the Department of Historical Humanities, and somehow she's managing to oscillate between the two places and keep two jobs down. And I'm not quite sure how she does that, but anyway, here she is today, and we're delighted to see her. She's currently working on various aspects of medieval Irish intellectual culture, and so is very well qualified to give the talk today, which is entitled Intersections Between Religion and Science in Early Medieval Ireland. So thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to start by thanking Dr Alexander for the invitation to speak here. I think it's a great example of the value of collegiate life in Cambridge, that a scientist and a scholar of medieval Ireland can sit next to each other at dinner and realise that they actually have interests in common, and that this can arise from that. Just before I start, I have to confess that the picture there is neither Irish nor early medieval. It's late medieval and French, but it's inappropriate for the talk. And I also have to say I didn't really know quite what to expect in terms of your own knowledge that you're coming to this with. So I've sort of assumed very little knowledge of early medieval Ireland. I apologise if I then spend 45 minutes stating the obvious, but I thought best to go in at an introductory level. Okay, so in the early Middle Ages, the term science, scientia, was not so narrowly defined as it is today in English-speaking countries. Latin scientia, meaning knowledge, embraced branches of learning which we would now define as arts and humanities, such as grammar, history, literary studies. Indeed, the modern German term Wissenschaft better exemplifies what people would have thought of as science in the early Middle Ages. However, despite this kind of broader understanding of what science meant in the early Middle Ages, I hope that today I'll be able to consider early medieval Ireland's contribution to disciplines which we would, even now by the modern, narrow English definition, recognise as sciences, including mathematics, computistics, and physical geography. So at times I will wander a little bit more broadly into disciplines such as philosophy and grammar, since these can't always be separated from narrowly scientific endeavours. But all of the elements which I'm drawing upon today will be heading in one direction. So I'll argue, fairly uncontroversially I think, that the ultimate end of all early medieval science was theology, knowledge of God. What's interesting about the case of early medieval Ireland is the breadth and variety of sources that we have relating to scientific or proto-scientific study. Medieval Ireland produced many thinkers who were intent on applying reason and even a kind of proto-empirical rationality in order to understand aspects of the universe which are fundamentally based on faith. So I hope to introduce just a small selection of texts to you today. There are other things that I could have mentioned, and I've just chosen a few. And hopefully they will suggest what I think are some key themes in early Irish scientific thought. But I'll begin with some basic introductory remarks on the nature of intellectual culture in early medieval Ireland and the types of scientific learning which are represented in the surviving evidence. So although there is some limited evidence for literacy in pre-Christian Ireland, literacy largely developed in tandem with Christianisation. And this is a process which was certainly underway by the 5th century at the latest, probably before. So with literacy, of course, comes the written evidence, which we can now use to build a picture of learned culture in medieval Ireland. And thus, the religious and intellectual culture of pre-Christian Ireland is now entirely lost to us, no matter what some popular books about Druids might tell you. We really don't have evidence for that. So from the beginning of literacy coming in really with Christianisation in the 5th century, from then up until the end of the 12th century, virtually all of the written sources which survived from Ireland were written in ecclesiastical foundations, so by educated clerics and or monks. After the end of the 12th century, the situation changes somewhat and learning moves into the lay sphere, and so knowledge of medicine, for example, or of law or poetry, increasingly becomes the preserve of hereditary secular learned families. However, this is outside the period which is under consideration today. So today I'm just going to talk about the period from the 7th century, which is when the first relevant texts were being written in Ireland, to the late 12th century. And therefore all of the evidence that I'm considering today has been written in and is emerging from a kind of clerical or monastic milieu. So what kind of sources do we have? Well, Ireland is remarkable for the sheer volume and variety of written evidence surviving from the early Middle Ages. And it must be noted that these sources survive not only in Latin, but in the vernacular Irish language. So in the words of Kim McCone, in addition to a very substantial Latin literature, early Christian Ireland boasts by far the most extensive and diverse vernacular literature in medieval Europe. The most important group of sources for our purposes today is the corpus of computistical texts, which survived from 7th and 8th century Ireland. But we also have very significant theological texts which make use of this kind of proto-scientific thought to elucidate points of doctrine, or which betray tangentially aspects of scientific thinking. In addition, there are texts on geography, on measurement, and on astronomy, ranging in date from the 7th through to the 12th century, and that's not even to mention the vast corpus of narrative literature, poetry, and so on, which is outside the scope of today's discussion. There are also very significant texts by non-Irish authors for which we have evidence of their being read and studied and commented on by Irish scholars. We'll discuss some of those too. So as I just mentioned, the most important sources are computistical texts, so I'll begin with computistics. At the outset, I would just like to note the groundbreaking scholarship of Davio Croinin, Jacopo Bisagni, and Imo Valtias, to which I'm heavily indebted in being able to discuss these texts at all today with you. So computistics is the science of calendrical calculations. Being able to accurately calculate date, and indeed time itself, is absolutely key to Christianity, of course, most particularly because Christianity's central feast, Easter, is a movable one. So since the 2nd century AD, Easter has been celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon in spring. And as Imo Valtias has noted, once it was determined that this is when Easter should be celebrated, mathematical and astronomical calculations needed to be formulated in order to calculate when that would be. So in origin then, computistics was a kind of subfield of mathematics and applied astronomy. But simply, very simply, to calculate the first Sunday after the first full moon in spring requires a synthesizing of the lunar and solar calendars. Now, the Julian calendar was the common solar calendar in use across Christendom at that time, but there were competing lunar calendars, and the Alexandrians and the Romans used various different cycles based largely on either 19-year or 84-year tables of lunar cycles. I can go into that in more detail afterwards in the discussion if people wish to. In the year 525, the monk Dionysius Exiguus was asked by the papal curia to resolve this dispute, and he came up with an accurate cycle based on the Alexandrian calculations. Now, this new system of dating Easter was finally adopted by Rome in the 640s, or slightly thereafter. In Anglo-Saxon England by the 660s, the churches in the south of Ireland had adopted the new system earlier than much of Anglo-Saxon England, seemingly by the early 7th century. Churches in the north of Ireland that we have evidence for seem to have followed slightly later, in the early 8th century. Welsh churches by the late 8th century, and on the continent in Francia, where the change was kind of piecemeal and regional, they seem to have completely converted to the new system by the 9th century. So this complexity of the accurate calculation of Easter and the failure by scholars to recognise the gradual and sophisticated way in which medieval ecclesiastics considered whether or not to change their method of calculating Easter has been grossly simplified into some kind of conflict between a so-called Celtic church and some kind of opposing either Anglo-Saxon church or Roman church. There is no truth to this characterisation. A concern with the reckoning of time then also has wider ramifications outside of simply calculating Easter, as important as that is. Does one know, for example, where we stand in relation to time? How old is the world? Can we calculate how close we might be to the end of the world, and thus to final judgment? How do we even know what the date and the time is right now? I struggle with that. So. And indeed, what is time, really? So in the 7th and early 8th centuries, computistical texts, which has started off simply as the tables just for calculating Easter, start to become actually sort of compendia of all kinds of information relating to time more generally. So the first source that I'd like to consider today, then, is the so-called Munich Computics, named thus because it's preserved in a manuscript in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich, but we know this to be an Irish text, not least because of the use of vernacular, Old Irish terminology, to explain certain concepts within what's otherwise a predominantly Latin text. And due to the internal evidence of its chronological calculations, the text can be dated to the year 719 AD. And the text conforms to the Dionysian system of calculating Easter. So the Munich Computics begins with the big question, interrogatio tempus, quid est? What is time? Our author gives a remarkably precise answer, actually. Time is the interval extending from the beginning to the end. Cleared that one up. The text goes on, though, to consider all areas of knowledge necessary for making calendrical calculations, including equinoxes and eclipses, leap years, lunar and solar cycles, the seasons, and the division of time. And we'll come back to this text later. But calculations of time, and particularly calendrical calculations, were rendered all the more complicated by the fact that, of course, at the time that our earliest texts were being written, Arabic numerals had not yet been introduced into Western Europe. Roman numerals are notoriously unwieldy for use in any kind of complex mathematics. But as with computists elsewhere in Europe, there is evidence that from the 7th century at the latest, Irish scholars were using either the Greek alphabet and or finger reckoning for making calendrical calculations. So when using the Greek alphabet for calendrical calculations, alpha through to iota is invested with a numerical value 1 to 10, then follows in decades from 20 kappa through to 100 rho, and then in hundreds, so that 200 is sigma, and so on to the end of the alphabet. But in addition to using the Greek alphabet, and again in common with other European scholars, the Irish used an enormously sophisticated system of finger reckoning for complex mathematical calculations. And I think of counting on fingers, I think of my 6-year-old daughter doing, 2 + 1 is 3. But the Irish had a more complicated system. So this image, it's actually from an early modern printed treatise, a version of De Temporum Ratione, which was written by the Northumbrian theologian and historian Bede, who died in 735. But this gives a useful illustration of how this system worked and how it could be applied for relatively advanced mathematics. So Bede's De Temporum Ratione actually provides us with a useful case study, which we can use to illustrate briefly a number of aspects of the study of scientific texts in early medieval Ireland, how this study actually worked. De Temporum Ratione, as I say, by the Northumbrian scholar Bede, was certainly read by Irish scholars, and we have evidence of their active engagement with its contents. So if we just take, more or less at random, a passage of Bede's De Temporum, Bede's here thinking about light emanating from the moon and stars, and he writes, Et quomodo nocte caeca procul accensus faces intuens. Cer compositor quaeque loca eodum lumine perfunde non dubitas, temexti tenebris noctis obstantibus. I translate that roughly as, and as on a dark night, looking at lit torches in the distance, you do not doubt that all the surrounding areas are bathed in the same light, so that's the light from the torches, notwithstanding the darkness of the night obscuring it. So what he's saying is that if you're looking at a torch far away on a dark night, you will assume, even though you can't see it, that the light surrounding it is coming from that same light source. It's coming from the torch and not from some other source of light. What did Irish scholars make of this passage? Well, Luckily for us, we have, for example, a manuscript copy of the text now preserved in Vienna, in which throughout the text we find evidence of how it was being read and understood. And so here is our manuscript that has been, in between the lines and in the margins, an Irish reader has gone through and added his notes, just as you might do when you're reading a scholarly article today, to help him to understand the text. So here, for example, Caker is being glossed with an Irish word, dorchi, meaning dark. Why has he glossed this? Well, presumably because the Latin cacus means blind, but Bede is using it here to mean dark. So he's using an Irish word meaning dark, which incidentally he's writing in the same case as the Latin. He's not just plugging it in the nominative. So he's writing the Irish word in the same case to clarify that cacus here means dark and not blind. And he's using other bits of Irish here. So this, you do not doubt it, the Irish here, Ken is even though you do not see it. That's what the Irish says there. So he's clarifying the Latin of the passage and expanding in some places. So these kinds of marginal and interlinear notes are important evidence for a number of reasons, not least because they show that the Irish language was not being used in a basic way to translate the Latin, but rather it's being used strategically at quite an advanced level to clarify the Latin where its meaning is ambiguous, or to supplement or explain concepts underlying the text's argument. So this kind of thing is really education in action in the early Middle Ages. Now, problems concerning sources of light at night time were of great interest to medieval scholars. Aside from Bede's discussion in De Temporum, we can provide another example by returning to the Munich Computics, where its author considers the source of the light of the moon. So he tells us that the philosophers say that the moon has its own light. One part of its globe is luminescent and the other obscure, and while turning itself, it creates different shapes. That's how you get the waxing and waning moon. Others argue that the moon is illuminated by the rays of the sun. So the question of whether the moon produces its own light or is reflecting light from the sun was a troubling one for scholars in the early Middle Ages. Some writers come down on one side of the fence or the other, but our Irish author, I think, is being a bit more cautious here, offering both opinions, for which he has authorities for both opinions. So he's offering both opinions without issuing a judgment as to which is the most likely. Bede, in case you're wondering, argues that the moon is illuminated by the sun. So lunar light continued to be of interest in the 9th century, as witnessed by the work of the Irish scholar Jekyll, whose Liber de Astronomia alternates between verse and prose, and draws on a range of earlier, predominantly classical sources on astronomy. The poetic sections of Jekyll's work are dense syntheses of scientific and religious thought, and can be very hard to unpick. So here's a bit of the verse section from the end of chapter 5 of his work. Preterita aut presens signum fallet me futura, in cunc discutas et semper lux mensibus anni, sumus dominus semper custodiet amus, ut plugias germinum peccantum vitae periculum. Rough go at this. I tried to translate it in verse and I couldn't, so I'll give you a kind of prose version. I think what he's trying to say is that as in the past or present, so also I will not be ignorant of how much light, and he's talking about lunar light, there is always to be in future in all the months of the year. May the supreme dear Lord protect you always, so that you may escape rightly the double danger of those who sin. Now, it's quite interesting in relation to modern scientific thought, actually, that Jekyll articulates, albeit in this very dense poetic language, quite an important concept, namely that the study of past and present phenomena allows him to predict future phenomena. He knows what lunar light will be visible at different times in the year because of past observations. And of course, it's one key criterion of the modern scientific method is that theory ought to be able to predict future results. So. But the overtly religious framework within which this idea is couched alerts us to the fact that this is not science for science's sake, but rather scientific inquiry for religious purposes, for the sake of avoidance of sin. And I suggest that the reference to escaping the danger of those who sin might relate to those who fail to calculate dates correctly, Jekyll had left Ireland by the time he wrote this and was a scholar at the Carolingian court in Francia when he wrote this treatise. And in the section which immediately precedes this verse, Jekyll discusses the placing of the Saltus, which, put very simply, is a day that has to be subtracted from lunar cycles in order to make the calculated lunar cycles coincide with solar cycles. And he writes that the English place the Saltus in November, but the Irish follow the example of Greek and Latin authorities in placing it in March. And his phrasing is quite interesting, because he's obviously just trying to suggest that Irish calculation has a greater historical authority behind it. And it's potentially these sorts of miscalculations, which he attributes to those not following venerable tradition in Computics, which can lead to sin, such as the potential failure to observe the correct days for liturgical celebrations, and particularly the failure to observe Easter on the correct day. Jekyll's text, as far as I've been able to tell, has not really been the subject of much scholarly attention. The text was edited in 1907 by Mario Esposito, but there's no English translation available, and my sense is this is something that would actually repay further study, particularly in relation to its style. And yeah, if anyone's looking for a research project, this is the thing that we should be looking into. But I wondered if there was a pointed thing as well about the Irish calculating things correctly and the English not, because Jekyll actually, as we learned from one of his other writings on the measurement of the Earth, he actually studied on Iona. He says that he owes any progress that he has made to his teacher, Sudna, who was abbot of Iona in the 8th century. And given that Iona was one of the last of the Irish churches to conform to the Dionysiac dating of Easter, I wonder if there is a slightly sort of defensive thing going on there about the fact that they now do it the correct way. But anyway, Computics was the bedrock of Irish scientific inquiry in the 7th and 8th centuries, and we've seen how Irish scholars could use Greek letters and finger reckoning in order to be able to calculate dates. Now, mathematics was again revived as a subject of study on the continent in the 10th century, and this revival had an impact in Ireland no less than elsewhere. A hugely important source for mathematical learning in the later period, namely the 11th and 12th centuries, is a single folio of a manuscript now in the British Library. Sort of adverse, something I'll get to later, which is the very poor survival rate of manuscripts in Ireland, but this is a single folio of a manuscript. British Library manuscript Egerton 3323, folio 18, is all that now remains of what could originally have been a larger 11th or early 12th century manuscript containing works on mathematics or perhaps some other types of educational texts. Now we can locate the manuscript geographically and chronologically because of a marginal note at the bottom of the folio which records the death of Tuathal, the abbot of Glendalough, in 1106. And so there's a note at the bottom that says, it's Whit Monday today here in Glendalough. It's sad news that Tuathal is dying today. And then bottom in the corner, someone's gone and added, it is sadder that he died last night and is being buried now. So we can precisely locate this manuscript in Glendalough in 1106. Now the contents of this folio have recently been studied by Mary Kelly of University College Dublin, and her findings are forthcoming in the Journal of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, so I'm very grateful to her for letting me see her paper in advance of its publication. So the first item on the folio then, beginning duo calci faciunt, is a table of equivalences of Roman fractions. The first fractions listed are extremely small. The first one, duo calci faciunt unum seratum, is 2 over 2,304 of something which itself weighs approximately 1/3 of a kilo in modern terms. So therefore the first fraction considered is approximately, I owe this to an eminent physicist in Trinity, so you have to trust me that it's right, is 1 over 3,456 of a kilo, or in other words, approximately 2/7 of a gram. Now, for modern scientists, that's not particularly anything special, but in the early Middle Ages, that's a fraction that's far too small to have any kind of practical value at all. And as Mary Kelly put it recently, not even drug dealers use weights that small, so it really has no practical use, this 2/7 of a gram. So unlike the minutiae usitates, or larger fractions, which were useful for practical purposes of weights and measures, these minutiae intellectuales theoretical fractions were useful only for abstract mathematical thinking. And this is significant because the arithmetic used in computistical texts, which we discussed from the earlier period, serves a practical purpose, calendrical calculations. But the tiny fractions of weights in this 11th century fragment hint at mathematics perhaps being used for more philosophical purposes. And the second section of the text then, Computizione Contraria, is a statement of numerical philosophy which draws on the most important mathematical work for early medieval thinkers, which is Boethius's De Arithmetica. As noted by Mary Kelly, the section Computizione Contraria concludes with an observation by its author that, and I'm quoting here from the manuscript, it says, "As matters of multiplication and division are covered in so many other books, then to attach a trifle in writing on matters less well known might not annoy." Now, this author refers then to the tables of Roman fractions which follow, that's the final thing on there, and he's adverting to the fact that this material does not represent the basics of mathematics, to which young scholars might expect to be exposed as part of a liberal arts education. And from this same period, we have vernacular Irish texts that list something called leave, which is reckoning or counting, as something that's part of a basic liberal arts education. But rather this is more advanced material, possibly intended for the purposes of metaphysical speculation. So we can see a reflection of this sort of learning and an example of how such learning might be applied in a theological context in the Latin treatise De Tribus Habitaculus Animae that was composed in Ireland before the year 1100. Can't tell you when before the year 1100, but the earliest manuscript is from 1100, so probably before then. The author considers why some people would choose 40 or 60 years of earthly pleasures and thereby risk facing an eternity of punishment. He considers then the relationship, or lack thereof, between a fixed period of time and eternity. And he says, "For there is some relation between the space of one day and that of 100 years, although it is minimal, but there is no relation between the space of 100 years and eternity. So if, for instance, the aforementioned space of time, that is 100 years, were 100th or 1000th part of eternity, after 100-fold or 1000-fold of that time, eternity would cease to exist, which the definition of eternity does not permit. For if it could in any way end in time, it would not be eternity at all." Now, trying to express the relationship between a fixed number and infinity, or as in this case, a fixed period of time and eternity, continued to interest physicists and mathematicians throughout the medieval period. And I'm tempted, perhaps a little speculatively, but I am tempted to link the evidence in edition 3323 for thinking about theoretical fractions with the glimpse in De Tribus Habitaculus of thought on the relationship between fixed time and eternity, since both seem to point to what I've been working on elsewhere in my research, to a rise in metaphysical thought in 11th century Ireland. We'll come back to that a bit later. But even from the earliest sources, in the 7th and 8th centuries, we can see a very strong interest in the relationship between small and large things, between the microcosmic and the macrocosmic, and between larger entities and their smallest constituent parts. So to return to the Munich Computus, with which we started, we might consider a concept which I hope will be familiar to everyone, atomos. We get the modern idea of atoms. So atomos is a Greek term and is to be translated as indivisible. As Isidore says, he's citing Isidore of Seville here, the philosophers call certain small parts in the cosmos atomos, as these can neither be seen nor can they be divided further. And then he goes on to say, atomos appear, however, in 4 domains, i.e. in an object and in time and in a number and in the sun. Now, atomos appear in an object as if you divide a stone into pieces, which you divide into grains, just like sand, which you divide then further into dust, which in turn you cannot divide any further, therefore you term this dust atomos. So our author states then that atoms occur in objects, that is, it's the smallest amount of something which cannot be divided any further, and in time, that is the smallest amount of time which cannot be divided further, and in numbers, so the smallest fraction which cannot be divided further. What's perhaps interesting is that later in the same text he also gives the example of sentences. The letter is the atom of a sentence because it cannot be divided further. He invokes the authority of the Latin grammarian Donatus and states, a passage is dissolved into sentences, a sentence is dissolved into syllables, a syllable is dissolved into letters, A letter has nothing into which it can be dissolved further, and consequently it is called atomos. And this example adverts to the fact that, as I mentioned at the outset, that grammar was considered to be as much a science as computistics or astronomy. These things can't really be separated. Indeed, we can see the fusion between aspects of medieval scientific thinking, grammatical thinking and theology in the work of the 7th century Irish grammarian Virgilius Maro Grammaticus. So to give an example here, he says, to go into the matter more closely, it seems to me that the litera is similar to the human condition. So just as man consists of a physical portion, a soul, and a sort of celestial fire, so too the letter is permeated with its body, that is, its shape, its function and its pronunciation, which are its joints and limbs, as it were, and has its soul in its meaning, sensus, and its spirit in its higher form of contemplation. In this manner, the practice of investigating the etymologies of words was in the early Middle Ages a science of sorts, in the sense that the method of etymologizing sought to explain the form and function of things, how they worked and how they came about, through the etymology of the name of the thing itself. So thus, for example, the Munich Computers tells us that the Latin word dies, is so called because it derives from the word dividendo, separating, because of the separating of light and dark. Okay, so what something is called and how that word comes about explains what it is, what its function is. Now, further interest in matter and in the substance of things is evidenced in an exceptionally interesting text called On the Miracles of Holy Scripture, written in Ireland in the mid-7th century by an author known as Augustinus Hibernicus, or the Irish Augustine. His text was widely disseminated in the Middle Ages because it was mistakenly attributed to Augustine of Hippo, but there is internal evidence in the text which shows that the author is Irish, and that he was writing possibly at the Ecclesiastical Foundation at Lismore in County Waterford, and was writing in the years 654 or 655. Now, what the Irish Augustine was attempting to do was to reconcile his understanding of the biblical account of creation, which was that after the 6th day God rested, with the existence of miracles. If, as he understood it, God finished creating after the 6th day, and now governed creation rather than creating new things, then it would follow that any miracle which occurred could not be an instance of God creating something new. No miracle could be contrary to nature, but rather must be evidence of God governing or steering what has already been created. Okay? So therefore, it must be possible to explain miracles according to the properties of the natural world. This is what he's setting out to do. So I'd just like to give you two examples, partly because I think his thought process is quite interesting, but also his arguments must reveal certain ideas about the material world that were more widely held in early medieval Ireland. I think we get a glimpse into how people are seeing the world more generally. So the first example is when the rivers in Egypt are turned to blood. And he asks us, how did God, the governor of nature, naturally change water into blood? So this is his reasoning. Water, the basis of every fluid, is by its daily operations in various creatures changed into different things, modified ceaselessly and naturally so as to provide nourishment and sustenance for every nature. And when it is assigned to different animals as nourishment, it is divided into several kinds of blood throughout the body. For it appears in the breasts with the white colour and mild sweetness of milk for the sustenance of infants, but in all other parts of the body it has the red colour of blood. So basically his underlying conception is that water is the fluid that underlies all other fluids. There are many other fluids in the body apart from blood. Natural philosophers put their number at 23, identifying them as urine, semen, black and red bile, saliva, tears, etc. And water becomes all these things through the daily workings of its nature in various creatures. What then hinders open minds from supposing that what can be achieved during a lengthy interval of time can also be accomplished naturally in a moment by the command of the most powerful governor? The changing of water to blood is not therefore contrary to nature, but what it affects in other things and in the course of time can also happen in water itself and at once if God so commands. So all God is doing is speeding up an existing process which occurs in nature. Another great example he has of this approach is Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt. And he says, well, there's sodium in the blood, so all it could just be is a very, very excessive build-up of sodium in the body, and bang, you're turned into a pillar of salt. Perfect rational sense. So our second example then is Moses' staff changing into a serpent and back into a staff again, and he takes a slightly different approach with this. So Moses' staff changed into a serpent and the serpent changed back again to wood constitute a problem for those who inquire into nature, unless it be that each, the staff and the serpent, appears to be made from earth. For being made from the same material, they could, by the power of God the governor, be changed into each other by turns. But if it be conceded that all things made from earth can be changed into one another by turns, as for instance, animal to tree, bread to stone, man to bird, then none of these could remain firmly within the bounds of its own nature. So he's saying it's not enough to say, oh, well, everything's fundamentally created from the earth, and therefore they can change from one to the other, or else we'd all be going around turning into stones and animals willy-nilly, you know. So that doesn't work for him. He decides in the end that the staff was not changed into the serpent's nature, but only in appearance and as a sign into its similitude. For nothing can be found in the nature of wood which would make a snake. For this reason, that which was given by its nature, that which was by its nature a staff, only appeared as a serpent at a time when the sign was given. So, as I noted, the arguments of the Irish Augustine must reflect more widely held ideas about the nature of matter and the kind of properties of substances and so on. Unfortunately for us, we have very few sources surviving which offer any kind of systematic accounts of such concepts in early medieval Ireland. There's one exception, the Liber de Ordine Creaturarum, which I'm avoiding speaking about today for several reasons, not least one, I'm not certain it's really been proven that the text is actually Irish, it could be English, and second of all, it would require an entire lecture on its own. Third of all, a brand new translation has just appeared in the most recent Journal of Medieval Latin, and I haven't consulted it carefully, so that's one interesting text that perhaps would be worth thinking about, but I'm going to not talk about it today. But generally, we must piece together our picture from indirect glimpses which we get from theological texts, such as on the miracles of Holy Scripture. And another good source of sort of tangential information about early Irish views of the material world is homiletic literature. And further evidence of a developing sophistication of ideas about matter can be seen in a Middle Irish homily, probably dating from the 11th century, on universal resurrection. So, for example, this homily tells us how, at creation, God fashioned the planetary bodies, then tligad nevechshida, agus gentligad nevchodtha, ro chechsa ro hinclitha into nadula, dia ro tusmida nachulpshin. So from the invisible form, and this is in the kind of Platonic sense of forms, and from the incorporeal form, which the elements out of which those bodies, the planets, were generated, possessed latent within them. Thus the author is showing that ideas ultimately derived from Greek thought via Latin translations were transmitted to Ireland and shaped one aspect of an underlying conception about how the universe was structured, that is, that prime matter contained latent within it the thing that it would become at the moment of creation. So the Platonic thought was that the Platonic thought that was widely disseminated in medieval Europe was also current in Ireland is evident in many sources. Unfortunately, considerations of time and, well, other considerations too prevent me from discussing Ireland's most famous philosopher and the translator of many Greek works into Latin, namely John Scotus Erigena, author of the most sophisticated philosophical work of the early Middle Ages, the Periphysian. As I say, it's not just time really that prevents me. There is also the debate which still rages actually about how much of Erigena's education he actually received in Ireland. And we actually have no certain evidence of his works being read in Ireland until the 12th century. He was a philosopher at the Carolingian court, I'm sure most of you have heard of him, and we don't have evidence before the 12th century of him being read in Ireland. So I've excluded him today. But the 12th century, then, when we first see Erigena being read, provides us with plentiful evidence of the influence of Greek thought in Ireland, as well as the influence of more recent learning. For example, an Irish manuscript now in the Bodleian Library at Oxford contains an abbreviated version of Erigena's Periphysian. This is our first evidence of the Periphysian being read in Ireland, and is now bound together with a copy of Chalcidius's Latin translation of Plato's Timaeus. The glosses on the Timaeus, which have been studied in detail by Padre Gonale, show the influence of recent continental scholastic learning in Ireland. So to give you just one very brief example, then, when Chalcidius is translating Timaeus' speech about what is on the right appearing on the left in those same mirrors in certain unusual fashion, the Irish reader has added a note, mainly in Irish, but he actually switches into Latin in the end there, and he's saying that, it says, the beam of light from the right appears in the left side of the mirror, or the other way around. And this note, and others like it in the same manuscript, it's quite heavily glossed manuscript. I was going to say this note reflects, but that's a terrible pun. This note reflects both the revival in Platonic learning in the 11th and 12th centuries, but also the new interest in optical physics, particularly reflection and refraction, which was growing as the result of the incorporation of Islamic scientific learning into Western Europe. But an interest in mirrors, reflection and reality also has a theological basis, of course, and grows out of exegesis on the Pauline statement that now we see as through a glass darkly. And so to give an example of this in action in Ireland, that quotation from 1 Corinthians 13 is cited in De Tribus Habitaculus Animae, the Latin treatise, but the author goes on to develop and even slightly invert the imagery of mirrors and reflection. So he says, for just as through a looking glass, a threefold vision is administered to us, because we see ourselves and the mirror itself, and we see whatever is present, thus through the mirror of divine clarity, we shall see God himself as he is, as much as it will be possible for a creature, and we shall recognise ourselves with true and certain knowledge. Now, although many of the texts that I've cited here today give us kind of tantalising glimpses of a coherent and sophisticated worldview, which is sadly lost to us in its entirety because of the lack of evidence, it must be noted that we are seldom offered more than glimpses. On a practical note, we must consider the poor survival rate of manuscripts from early medieval Ireland. And you might have noticed as I was going along that I was talking about this manuscripts in Munich, this manuscripts in Vienna, this manuscripts in Oxford. Very few manuscripts survive from the early medieval Ireland unless they were taken to the continent either by medieval scholars or in the early modern period. So further to the generally poor survival rate, we have to notice that technical, educational and frequently used manuscripts are even less likely to survive than, for example, high-status display gospel books. But even if we think about high-status display gospel books, the decoration of those manuscripts reflects the results of a very advanced knowledge of geometry for which we have no direct evidence. And I have to say, something like the Cairo page on the Book of Kells, if that isn't a stunning example of applied geometry, then I don't really know what is. So, some conclusions then. As I say, this has been a very introductory talk, just giving you an idea of what there is, but I think even from the few things I've discussed today, I would say that the glimpses we get from the surviving material do suggest a kind of dynamic engagement with scientific learning in the early Middle Ages, and in particular that Ireland was a leading contributor to computistical study before around the year 900. Evidence from the 11th century onwards suggests that time is still a key interest, but you actually get a shift away generally from computistics towards an interest in history and chronology, really. Although an exception would be Marianus Scotus, a scholar based in Mainz in Germany, but an Irishman, who does preserve a lot of computistical learning in his works on chronology. I think it's possible to argue, I haven't really given you enough evidence for it today, but I think more generally it is possible to argue for a rise in metaphysical thought in the 11th and 12th centuries in Ireland in the face of new influences that are coming into Ireland from the European schools. But the purpose of this learning was to understand the universe in order to understand God. So the purpose of science was theology in the early Middle Ages. So just to finish off then, I'll say Martin Blake recently published an edition of an Anglo-Saxon text on the reckoning of time, namely Ælfric's De Temporibus Anni. And in his preface to that edition, Blake writes that for Ælfric, to explain to an audience about the nature of the universe was to explain to them something about the nature of God. To teach about the events of creation and the setting in motion of the cosmological clock, which to his day governed the succession of the seasons and the motion of the celestial bodies through the heavens, was to teach the crucial importance of commemorating in the Christian calendar the events of salvation history. And the same can be said, I think, for all the Computists and other thinkers which we've considered today. I think in some respects the title of my talk this afternoon, namely Intersections Between Religion and Science in Early Medieval Ireland, is slightly misleading, because essentially religion and science do not intersect in early medieval Ireland, but rather they are one and the same thing. Scientia, science, knowledge of the world, is, in early medieval Ireland, knowledge of God. But I hope that we might still note with admiration the ingenuity and intellectual vibrancy of these pre-modern inquiries into the natural sciences and the nature of the universe. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Well, I'm sure that stimulated plenty of questions.
Well, I was very interested in your Irish Augustine, because there's a very similar analysis of Moses' rod in Augustine of Hippo, who says, well, this is not against nature for God. It might look like that for us, but we don't know. But for God it's not so, because nature is what God has made. It's sort of, so I don't know whether there's a...
Yeah, well certainly, I mean, the Irish Augustine knew his Augustine, and you can see why his text gets misattributed to the real Augustine, the earlier Augustine, in the Middle Ages, because it's very Augustinian. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me in a way, because he certainly is reading his Augustine and using Augustinian thought, which is actually very influential in 7th century Ireland more widely, actually. A lot of texts that draw very heavily on Augustine. And,
Yeah.
Thank you. His question here is...
You mentioned that they were very dependent on authorities. Is there any evidence that they were into original thinking different from the authorities, or were they mainly commenting on authorities?
They're mainly commenting on authorities. The startling original thinker is Eriugena. He's the person who's really doing something different. And as I say, the problem is we don't have direct evidence of Irish scholars reading Eriugena until the 12th century. I think, so there's been a long scholarly, to call it debate, that sounds too polite, disagreement about the extent, for example, of Greek learning in early medieval Ireland, and whether someone like Eriugena, whose originality is filtered through having direct access to these Greek sources, whether he could have learned that level of Greek in Ireland or not. Which I think at the moment, I think it'd be fair to say that the scholarly opinion is kind of hanging in the balance. That there is better evidence than previously thought for knowledge of Greek, but nothing that really equates with Eriugena. He's such a phenomenally original mind. But the thing is, I think in the early Middle Ages, originality is not necessarily desirable. That's the point. Is that the point is to find. I mean, for example, the philosopher Hegel that I talked about in his book on astronomy and on the measurement of the Earth, he talks about, you know, finding the most accurate copy of an authority, leaving spaces blank where you don't think that the figures look correct, and people could go and correct things, expand on things. He sometimes adds sort of empirical knowledge based on his own observations, but generally people aren't really looking to be original. I think point, what's desirable is finding the most sound authority and making use of that, I think.
Please, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Very, very interesting talk. In the early church in the Near East, if you look at the patristic writings, you will see that they engage in a debate between knowledge, knowledge of God, or knowledge of things, which comes through the spiritual intellect, the noetic impulse, and knowledge which comes through the spiritual heart, as it were, the more sort of experiential, empirical knowledge. And in this sort of big debate, in this big tension, there was a tension between these two. And, you know, to make a huge complicated story too simplistic, the West tended to go with sort of the rationalic bit, but the sort of knowledge of the heart bit was never lost within the Eastern traditions. And I wondered, you made a reference to the Irish church being a Celtic church, which did get its origins from these sort of Eastern monastic traditions. And I wondered if there were any evidence of this kind of experiential knowledge coming into their written, whatever remains in their writings and in the debates that they had.
I mean, that's really quite a big topic of debate in scholarship at the moment, really, to what extent you can even characterise such an entity as a Celtic church. Really, the diversity in local diversity in Christianity between, say, Wales, Ireland and Scotland means that you can't really speak of a Celtic church. But in terms of the Irish literature, there is some very, very nice kind of lyric poetry surviving from the early Middle Ages that perhaps does express a kind of more experiential relationship with God. What's interesting is that it tends to be preserved in the margins of manuscripts that are really about kind of intellectual, rational works. So in grammars, Latin grammars, for example, you sometimes get little verses in the margins which do seem to maybe point to that. But I think, as with the rest of the West, maybe the Irish church really is more looking at kind of, the rational, the intellectual kind of experience of God, of creation and so on. It's probably sort of fitting that the more experiential verses are quite literally marginal in a way, that they're in the margins of manuscripts, but perhaps they're also marginal to the predominant intellectual tradition. But there are some examples which are very nice, in nice poetry.
Peace, yes.
You mentioned before the grammar considered as a science, and you had the example of the atomos and the letter of the alphabet. Do you know of any other examples like of grammar used like perhaps in a mathematical way, or apart from the Greek letters used as numbers? I'm not saying that, but really like as a perhaps the conception of the alphabet as a science or.
Yeah, that's a really good question actually, and I'm completely failing to think of anything off the top of my head, but I would suggest there's a very good book by Vivian Law, The Insular Latin Grammarians, that was published by Boyd Ellen Brewer decades ago, but I mean that's probably an excellent place to start. And also Vivian Law's book on Virgilius Maro Grammaticus would be another good place to look. I'm not thinking of anything off the top of my head, but those would be good places to go and start.
Can I ask about, you mentioned in passing the discussion about the age of the earth and so on. I mean, how did they go about addressing that kind of question? What was their procedure? Again, authorities.
So again, taking authorities, earlier authorities, it's very much that there are 6 ages of the world, and so you get these kind of sextates mundi texts being transmitted in Ireland. There's a strong Augustinian, I suppose, sense that it's not for us to calculate when the last age is going to end. You don't really get any kind of millenarian thought or apocalypticism or anything like that. But in terms of calculating back, it's very much these six ages of the world. What's interesting in the Irish case is that they're quite aware of the fact that they weren't, for example, part of the Roman Empire. They're quite aware of the fact they're not mentioned in the Bible. They're quite aware of the fact that they don't really necessarily share in that kind of chronology in history. So what you start to get, certainly by the 10th and 11th centuries, possibly earlier, is attempts to synthesize an Irish prehistory with biblical chronology. And so you get, there's a famous book, the Levogavala Erin, the book of the invasions of Ireland, where this kind of pre-Christian Irish history is framed as something that's analogous to Old Testament chronology and history, and you start to get synthesizing of dates in Irish history with Old Testament chronology. So they're sort of aware of being slightly outside that kind of worldview, and that they need to sort of synthesize their chronology with Christian chronology. But again, in terms of calculating the age of the world and so on, very much drawing on Augustine.
Thank you. Good. Other questions, please? Yes.
The fact that we're all sitting here seems to me to reflect the current conviction about the false dichotomy between science and religion. So, given the passage of time since what you've been talking about was written, what do you feel, I'm not a scientist, I'm on the theological side, but what do you think is their unity of thought can be brought into the present, you know, in terms of our understanding. You know, what's the sort of essence of what they've got to offer with this?
An incredibly difficult question. I don't know, and I'm not a scientist either, so I can't really sort of say. I mean, I don't know. I think it's a completely different world view, and I think it's a sophisticated worldview and an interesting worldview. But I have to confess that it's something I study for its inherent interest on its own terms, and not necessarily that I feel that I can bring lessons in or whatever. But I mean, reading the literature of early medieval Ireland just, you know, repays you because it's so brilliant. You know, it's fantastic to read and interesting and so on. But I don't know, I wouldn't be one for drawing lessons from or anything from the past.
I guess one comment we can add to that is, if you come to a few years worth of Faraday seminars, then I think, you know, you get a flavour for actually that point. But I think it would be multi-storied, you know, lots and lots of narratives will come through actually to address that particular point. But after listening to the next 24 speakers, you know, then it would sort of so that would be my little point there. So I think we have time for one more question. So if anyone else ask a question, yes, right, no, right at the back, yes. So, yeah.
Was there a particular location in Ireland, apart from Iona, in the way that in Anglo-Saxon England the three monasteries in Northumbria, Jarrow and Montgomery were the kind of centres of learning? Was there a place in Ireland that performed the same role, or was it more?
Yeah, there are major ecclesiastical centres which seem to have the best stocked libraries and the best number of scholars. So, for example, Bangor in the north of Ireland, and Armagh as well. Later Clonmacnoise becomes very important. And yeah, it's certainly, I would say this kind of learning is centred on major ecclesiastical foundations that were big, kind of multifunctional. They were usually a bishopric and had monastic houses and were providing pastoral care and so on. So these are big foundations. I think most churches in early medieval Ireland, you know, would have had a liturgical book and a Gospels or something. You're not talking about well-stocked libraries generally. So it's a few centres, yeah. So as I say, kind of Clonmacnoise, Armagh, Bangor, really major centres, for example.
Well, I think we've got to 2 o'clock and we've worked our speaker very hard, but I think we want to thank you very much for a fascinating voyage through an area in geography and history that probably most of us don't visit very often. It's been really stimulating. Thank you very much.